Professor MEDIAFRIKA, Chairperson of the Board of NASPERS, Mr. Ton Foslu, Head of the Department of Journalism, Professor Lizette Rabi, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor and privilege to address you on this very special evening for 30 graduates. Before I start with my presentation, let me also congratulate the university and the department on this magnificent building. It is not as big as Rhodes' media matrix, but it's more beautiful despite its size. I envy you working in this space. Most of the B.Phil graduates will, I assume, soon enter the media world as media practitioners of one kind or another. At least 2 of the M.Phil graduates, I'm told, are already working in the media, and the other 3 may well end up working in the media also. I've therefore titled my talk, Entering the Media World: Traditional Values, New Trends, New Challenges. Broadly, I will touch on global media, national media, and the rising phenomenon called citizens' media, and will conclude with a few thoughts on the core issues underpinning the media, freedom and independence. I was told that the average age of the group of graduates is 23, which means most of you were born around 1988. So from time to time, I will harken back to 1988 to get a glimpse of the media world as it then was, because that was the time when we had the traditional journalist and the traditional journalist practicing traditional journalism. Let's first touch on global media. In 1988, I go back, people talked about the Americanization of the media world. Today we talk about the globalization of media. Although American media corporations still dominate the world scene, media companies from other countries are now involved in media across the world. In 1998, 30 conglomerates dominated global media. Today, it's down to 10. 6 of them are American. The other 4 are Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation, Australia, Vivendi Universal, France, Bertelsmann, Germany, and Sony, Japan, which make up the 10. Even great institutions like the Wall Street Journal have fallen victim to corporate acquisition, while small quality publications like Le Monde struggle to survive. It's a question of the survival of the biggest. Journalism today, in a world that is more interconnected than ever before, journalists work today in a world that is more interconnected than ever before, and they work in a world that is dominated by this handful of media conglomerates, which are essentially corporate and entertainment entities that care little about journalism as a public service. As the CEO of Westinghouse, which owns CBS in the United States, put it very bluntly and quite without any shame, we are here to serve advertisers. In 1988, we had the traditional journalist who treasured journalistic independence and whose first loyalty was to citizens. Today's journalists, with notable exceptions, of course, imbibe corporate culture. Editors too, again with exceptions, are becoming increasingly comfortable with the values and mission of the new owners. I'm talking globally, I'm not talking about the Argus and Cape Times. So they're becoming comfortable with the values and mission of the new owners, committed to increasing profits and returns to shareholders. Globalization has ushered in a different set of values: efficiency, competition, and free market. It is also a destabilizing force, full of ills and shortcomings. Understanding its mechanisms and dynamics is vital for today's journalist. Many issues cannot be approached without addressing the global dimensions and context. How, for example, can journalists write comprehensively and authoritatively about the environment, climate change, global economic crisis, nuclear proliferation without information on these subjects from different countries? So today's journalist, if you want to enter the global world, for the 30 who are graduating today, you have to think in global terms. Now coming to the national media, our own media. What was the media like in South Africa in 1988 when you were born? Apartheid was still alive, Broadcasting was under state control, and private commercial and radio and television was not allowed. Print media was run by four monopolies. There were 110 laws curbing press freedom. The internet was just beginning to take off. New media was in its first strides. Social media was virtually non-existent. After 1994, media underwent a sea of change. The public broadcaster is no longer a state broadcaster, though that may be more in theory than reality. The airwaves have been deregulated with privately owned free-to-air commercial station. The media landscape is populated by dozens of commercial radio stations and scores of community newspapers and radio. Print media ownership has diversified with foreign, black, and white ownership. In 1988, there was just one black editor in the country. Today, the majority of editors are black. Transformation in South Africa has brought with it its own problems. With pressure on media houses to effect changes that reflect the demographics of the country, too many inexperienced journalists were promoted prematurely to positions they were ill-equipped to handle. In 1988, you would be hard-pressed to find an editor under the age of 50. Today, few are over the age of 40. Not all journalists were able to cope with the new environment, with new challenges. Some got too close to politicians and became friends and confidants of the new ruling elite. And a new class of journalists emerged, those who joined the profession for money and social status, or saw it as a stepping stone to a government or corporate job. Over the past decade or so, the industry has lost some of its best journalists to these sectors where the pay, in most cases, is much higher. Last week, I attended a function at the Institute for the Advancement of Journalism in Johannesburg. 3 veteran journalists were honored for their lifetime contribution to journalism. Raymond Lowe, 65 years. That's not his age. That's how long he's been in journalism. Alistair Sparks, 60 years. And George Lolwe, 50 years. In case you don't know who they are, Raymond Lowe was the editor of the Rand Daily Mail in the 1980s. He publishes a newsletter today, and he's an active campaigner for press freedom. Alistair Sparks succeeded him as editor of the Rand Daily Mail. He's a columnist for Business Day and the author of 4 books on contemporary South African politics. George Lolwe is a veteran journalist, worked on several newspapers, and was also editor-in-chief of news at both SABC and ETV, and today is our press ombudsman. They are fascinating. By the way, I should say that if Ton Vosloo was in Johannesburg, he would be in that company. None of them, they are fascinating stories to tell. None of them went to university. None of them had any formal journalism training. They entered journalism as teenagers, right after high school. They rose to become giants in South African journalism. As each said, none of them is rich, but none would choose any other profession. They embody the best traditional values of journalism. But they also had the advantage of working in an era when the ethos of media owners was different. Newspapers were there to provide a public service. Today's media, on the other hand, are run more and more as businesses. Editorial and training budgets have come in for severe cuts, and journalism as a public service is no longer considered a priority. Television and radio no longer provide content for audiences, but are involved in selling audiences to advertisers and sponsors. Inevitably, advertisers disproportionately influence what people get to watch and read. Advertisers, of course, prefer affluent to poor audiences who are deprived of information. Local content has suffered through economies of scale. As newspapers and broadcasters come under increasing pressure to produce profits for their owners, content has suffered. Crime, sport, celebrities, and gossip dominate media coverage, while real issues that affect the country and the world are neglected. Social problems in our country are in a very grave state. We should never forget that we live in a country with the widest gap in the world between rich and poor. You know, believe it or not, we've overtaken Brazil, overtaken India. Pole position, #1 in the world. There are 5 million people of your age in this country without jobs. The responsibility on the media to live up to its traditional role in providing a voice for the voiceless and promoting democracy and development has never been greater. A brief word on citizens' media, and I say only a few words because I belong to a generation that is baffled by the great media revolution. The power of individual communication via cell phone, SMS, and other networking technologies like Facebook and Twitter, almost at minimal cost. All one needs is a computer or smartphone in order to integrate into a globalized world where citizens can broadcast and share the message or create one's own group or even a movement. Existing international and national laws have been overtaken by the new technologies, though of course dictators like Egypt's Mubarak are not averse to taking such drastic steps as shutting down the internet altogether. Citizens' media is becoming a powerful alternative to mainstream media. Citizens' media is not new, of course. The democratic right to freedom of expression gives every citizen the right to be a journalist, to report or to publish an opinion or comment. But citizen journalism has blossomed with the internet. Citizens' media has responded to traditional mass media's neglect of public interest and partisan portrayal of national and world events and issues. It contributes to media diversity, a better informed citizenry, strengthens democracy, and could even, as we have seen in Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya, lead to the creation of democracy. Citizens' media poses new challenges to today's professional journalists, getting that story quickly and getting that story accurately. While citizens' media may be welcomed and encouraged, it is important to bear in mind that in a country like ours, only a small percentage of citizens have access to the internet and a proficiency in the English language. Internet penetration in South Africa is a mere 11%. When you compare that, we would say the UK, 83%, Australia, 80%, and US, 78%. Until that statistic changes and literacy increases dramatically, citizens' media in developing countries like South Africa will unfortunately remain a media outlet for the educated and relatively wealthy elite. Now on to freedom and independence. I'm okay for time? Thank you. Central to an effective and relevant media is freedom and independence. Also important are issues of quality, reach, and diversity. The quality of the media is to a large extent determined by the quality of journalism. Guarantees of media freedom could be nullified by journalism that is unprofessional and falls short of accepted ethical norms. Freedom and independence are too easily compromised by legislation, powerful private interests, low levels of literacy, lack of human capital and technology. The legal framework and ownership structure remain the primary determinants of media independence and media freedom. However, good legislation is not necessarily in itself a guarantor of independence and freedom of expression. Equally important is an enabling environment and culture that respects and values a free press. Now, you would have seen at the plaque outside that Professor Lizette Rabi referred to Nelson Mandela's quote on media freedom. But on another occasion, he expressed a similar sentiment, but with different words. I'll read these to you. South Africa should put freedom of the press and media at the top of its priorities as a democracy. None of our irritations with the perceived inadequacies of the media should ever allow us to suggest, even faintly, that the independence of the press could be compromised or coerced. A bold, free press is preferable to a technically good, subservient press. End of quote. But things began to change under the Mbeki government. Ultra-sensitive to criticism, Mbeki accused some newspapers of going beyond their watchdog role and playing an opposition role in government. He told a delegation from the World Association of Newspapers during the time that he was in power that it was one thing for the media to have opposed the apartheid government because it was an unjust system, but it was wrong that some newspapers have that same attitude to the democratically elected government. Unfortunately, Mbeki's misguided views have a history in Africa. They are typical of the attitude of post-colonial African rulers, right from Nkrumah in 1957. For example, Tanzania's respected first president, Julius Nyerere, had this to say about the media in his country almost half a century ago, when Tanzania had just attained independence. Too often, the only voices to be heard in opposition are those of a few irresponsible individuals, that means journalists, We exploit the very privileges of democracy: freedom of the press, freedom of association, freedom to criticize, in order to deflect government from its responsibilities to the people by creating problems of law and order. During the liberation struggle in Namibia, the Namibian newspaper was an avowed supporter of the liberation struggle under SWAPO. After independence, the Namibian reverted to its traditional role of a newspaper to hold the powerful accountable. What did the SWAPO government do? It withdrew all advertising revenue, all government advertising from the Namibian. No more government advertising. While the SWAPO government was quite open and blatant in its punishment of the Namibian, the ANC government resorted to similar tactics, albeit in a more subtle way, against the Mail and Guardian, which also, as a weekly mail in the 1980s, supported the ANC and the liberation struggle. How do I know this? Because when I was CEO of the Mail and Guardian, I don't have it in print over here because if you ask me to divulge my sources, I won't. When I was CEO there, when they gave us no advertising, I got it from very high up in government, very high up in the ANC, that this is unwritten policy of the ANC, not to advertise in the Mail and Guardian. Under President Zuma, the enabling environment and culture has more or less gone into oblivion. He has a propensity to sue media for defamation and has little tolerance for a critical media. Which brings me to the much debated two pieces of pernicious legislation the government is contemplating introducing: the Media Tribunal and the Protection of Information Bill. I do not have the time here to dwell on these, but I'm sure that you have debated these in your lectures and even outside the lectures, and you all have views of them. The Media Tribunal appears to have been put on the back burner as the industry tries to strengthen self-regulation. The concept of self-regulation is a viable and internationally accepted alternative to state intervention and court processes. A press which is regulated by government or courts cannot be truly free. But the government seems determined to go ahead with the Protection of Information Bill, which, if enacted, will be a major setback for transparency and accountability, the bedrocks of any democracy. What all of these underline is that constitutional guarantees are less effective in ensuring a free media than a culture of tolerance and an enabling environment. The United States, with its First Amendment, is often held up as a beacon of press freedom. But in Reporters Without Borders 2010 world rankings of all the countries in the world on press freedom, the US ranks are relatively number 20. Thanks to the embedded journalists during the Iraq War, the patriotic journalist after 9/11, and the corporate journalist of today. South Africa ranks an even lower 38, despite having one of the best constitutions in the world, with a Bill of Rights that guarantees freedom of expression. Thanks again to the Media Tribunal, the Protection of Information Bill, the retention of the antiquated apartheid-era laws like the Section 205 of the Criminal Procedures Act, which forces you to divulge your sources, and the ruling party's resort to using defamation laws to bring dissenting journalists and newspapers to book. So that's why we are down there at 38, despite all the good words of Mandela. So in conclusion, this is a media world 30 of you will be entering, a national arena of decreasing tolerance for freedom of expression and a globalized world of corporate media and corporate culture. Some of you may well go overseas in search of experience and adventure, but most of you, I imagine, will find work in one of our many media outlets. Those working in South African media will face particular challenges. Journalism is a profession unlike any other, like law, medicine, or accountancy. Since there are no laws of journalism, no regulations, no licensing, no mandatory professional body, a heavy burden rests on the ethic and commitment of the individual journalists. A recent study by the National Press Club, just at the end of last year, found that 69% of editorial teams had codes of ethics, but only 21% of journalists referred to the codes regularly. Competition, pressure of deadlines, limited staff, and lack of resources, I assume, meant there was little time to cross-check the facts and interrogate your story. Good ethical decision-making is at the core of good journalism. Codes are easy to draw up. How to implement the codes is a difficult part, because there are more gray areas than black and white areas in codes of ethics. Balancing the public's right to know without infringing the individual's right to privacy, for instance, are not clearly spelled out in codes. It requires asking the right questions through a consultative process that may involve the news editor, the editor, and others. The best guarantor of press freedom is the media itself. It has to win the support and respect of the people and create a culture of transparency and accountability. To do this, it has to lead, it has to educate, and above all, aspire to the highest professional standards by never veering from the cardinal journalistic principles of accuracy, fairness, and balance. It must remain faithful to its watchdog role and never fail to provide a voice for the voiceless. But too often, as that famous American media critic Noam Chomsky reminds us, the watchdog only barks when elite interests are threatened. Speaking of the US media, Chomsky said that they, and I quote, they permit, indeed encourage, spirited debate, criticism, and dissent, as long as these remain faithfully within the system of presuppositions and principles that constitute an elite consensus, a system so powerful as to be internalized largely without awareness. As I've already said, ours is a country with huge social problems. Massive unemployment amongst black youth, with the inequality gap, as I said, between rich and poor, the biggest in the world. Corruption is rife, and a politically well-connected elite is amassing massive wealth, sometimes through shady government tenders and dubious BEE deals. In recent days, racism, the curse of our past, has reared its ugly head, articulated by a new black, narrow nationalist elite. As our new generation of journalists, you must ensure that our media should never fall into the trap of elite consensus. Far better, you heeded the words of one of America's pioneering media magnates, the famous William Randolph Hearst, and I saw one of his quotes down, but this is a different one, who said, the role of the media is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. I wish every one of you, 30 graduates, every success in whichever arena of the big, wide, and exciting media world you choose to enter. I apologize for speaking only in English. I was born and brought up in Durban, and Afrikaans was never taught, and I spent many years in exile where you had a hope in hell of learning Afrikaans. Thank you very much.